All right, I hope you all enjoyed the unexpected extension you got on your homework assignment, but time is well and truly up. Pencils down, hand in your papers. Let's review the responses. Let me take this moment now to urge you to go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics and sign up for their fall courses. You still have a few days to do it. The registration closes on August 10th, and you can get 10% off if you use the promo code Spencer, SPENCER, just my name when you check out. They will teach you how to read Latin, Biblical Hebrew, Biblical Greek, and or Anglo-Saxon, depending on any of those ones that you may be interested in, and they will do so in a way that gets you reading fast. One of the problems and frustrations that people often have when they embark upon the endeavor of learning one of these ancient languages is they get into it because they want to read the Bible, or they want to read Homer, or they want to read whatever. And then for the first 4 years, all they're doing is conjugating verbs. And I don't think this is a very effective way of teaching. I was always most excited to get reading real Latin when I first started out, and I expect you feel that way too. Ancient Language Institute has got you covered. One more time, it's ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics to sign up. Courses are the deadline is almost done, August 10th, but you can still get in under the gun, and they do have other options available after that fall course deadline as well. So go check them out, ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics. Okay, last time we did a words episode, I gave you the first ever Young Heretics homework assignment, and then I was unexpectedly delayed in collecting the responses because we're having some work done here at the house, and you always want to let the contractors do their stuff when they are able to do it, because especially in places like Nashville, this stuff can be at a very high premium. I'm excited. We're actually building a new office for me, which I'm really stoked to show you guys when it all comes together, but it's going to be a while yet. And in the meantime, we've got some banging going on in the house, and I decided it was better to let the audio be clean by waiting over the weekend. So I gave you the weekend, an extra bit of time to complete the assignment while we went out to a family wedding. And now, pencils down, hand in your papers. Time is really up because we've gotten a lot of really interesting responses. So to remind those of you who might need reminding, the question at hand was, when Jesus, whom you may know as the Christ, from his work as Son of God, Savior of the world, when Jesus says, "This is my body," at the Last Supper, and "this is my blood," what does the word "is" mean? And there's been a long dispute about this in the Christian church. Luther and Zwingli, two major figures in the era of the Reformation, had a big dispute over whether he was saying this bread is metaphorically, symbolically my body. It stands in some way for who I am, and by consuming it, you can take into yourself some reminder or awareness, understanding of what you are, or what I am rather, and what you are to be in my image. That was sort of Zwingli's position, was the "it's a symbol" position, and then Luther's position was the "is means is" position. So last week I said, I don't really think it can possibly be that simple, because when does "is" ever really just mean "is"? There are all these different ways that word can be used in the English language, and I reviewed a bunch of them with you, both as a way of thinking about this theological question, but also abstracting away from the very heated theological debates, just in pure grammatical terms, kind of nerding out with you guys about all the different ways that the copula, that is the linking verb "is," can function in an English sentence, and what it says about things we believe regarding the nature of essence. And Zoolander made it in there. You can go back and listen to the episode to review. But we ended up with kind of three basic options for how the word "is" can function. It can be There are other ways that it can work, but in this case, three possibilities for what Jesus is saying. One would be the strict philosophical definition of predication. And this is not just the grammatical idea that predication is the part that links on to the subject of the sentence and tells you what the subject does or is, but specifically that when you predicate something, you say this particular is an instance of a universal. So in that case, Jesus would be saying this particular loaf of bread is one physical embodiment, one instance of the universal concept or abstract Platonic ideal or something that is my body. Just in the same way that if I pointed at a piece of paper and I said, this is an essay, I would be showing you one piece of paper with writing on it that served for me as an embodiment, instance, example of the thing that is an essay. So that would be one option. That's predication. The other option, the next option, would be inclusion, which is a slightly broader form of predication where you say all X's are Y's. So if I gestured around and I said all these things are birds, I would be saying the set of things that I'm pointing at in the sky right now, they all fall under the category bird. And so there are some acts of predication involved, but it's a bigger thing. It's like saying all eagles are birds, all men are rational animals, yada yada. This is inclusion, where you take one set and you nest it inside of another. Then the other option would just be pure identity. So that would be Jesus pointing at this loaf of bread and saying, this bread is the same thing as this body that is mine. Not my body in some universal sense, but my body, the here physically that you can touch, is the same thing as this bread. And then on top of all of that, I layered on the extra option that it might also be a metaphor in some way, that all of those different kinds of uses of the word is can be metaphorical, which means that they don't literally describe the way that Tank, my cat, is a cat. But if I said Tank is a gentleman, I would not be saying he's a human being that wears suits. I would be saying he behaves in some way that metaphorically you can understand, that if you think about gentlemen and their behavior, you can understand some things about the cat. So I asked you to write in what you think the sentence means, how it works, how it functions grammatically, and what that says about this very sacred act of communion that we take if we are Christians. Basically all Christians of any Orthodox variety take some kind of communion at some time, but how you do it, when you do it, why you do it will depend on your interpretation of these sentences, this idea of is. And so I asked you to write in and say, what do you think? There were some great answers. I'm going to pick a few, not because they weren't all interesting. I love all my children equally, all my listeners equally. No, but genuinely, you all sent in good stuff. And I would love to read them all, but we don't really have time. So I'm just going to pick a few that seemed representative or particularly interesting. And then I'm going to tell you what I think the right answer is. Not that I am like some privileged authority here. I'm just your humble book bro who leads you through these sorts of questions for fun. So Lydia writes in and she says, my instinct is to say that if we are to take our Lord literally, when he says, this is my body and this is my blood, we must also take him literally when he says things like, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, and I am the vine, all clearly symbolic. So Lydia makes the good point, textual point, that Jesus was fond of speaking, if not in metaphor, then certainly in parable. And I think often there are parables within metaphors and metaphors within parables, event into a larger pattern of ritual, and that's in the Bible too. Whenever you drink it, do this in memory of me. So Glenn suggests that this is an instance of inclusion, that anytime this thing happens, when we eat bread and drink wine in a ritual way in memory of God, it becomes Jesus' body and blood in a literal way, but not, Glenn says, in a limited materialistic sense. So we're talking about a literal inclusion of the essence of all bread ever eaten at communion with the essence of Jesus' body, or who Jesus was, and his actions in the world, and that those two things achieve a kind of union together when we do communion. And when Jesus said that was sort of what was happening. He was pointing to this inclusive relationship between all instances of action, behavior in the world, anything we might do in the world that might look like Jesus acting through us, and including that as my body, and then saying, this bread is an instance of my body too. So this physical material will now become for you a symbol or a real identity, but of all times that you eat the bread. And this kind of raises another interesting question, which is also grammatical, and that's, what is the referent of this? So the referent is the thing in the sentence that a pronoun stands in for. So when you say a pronoun, we all know about pronouns now because they're in the news all the time. Pronouns are words that stand in for nouns. So I is a pronoun, you is a pronoun, he, she, it, they, them, sie, zur, etc., etc. These are pronouns because they indicate, without designating a particular individual. If I say he's over there, you can fittingly ask who's over there, and then I would have to say Jeff. So Jeff is the noun, he stands in for it, who also actually stands in for it. It's an interrogative pronoun. And we have all these words. There is a pronoun in this is my body. It's this. And the question is, what is this? Because if it's an active inclusion, it can't just be this particular bread. But I also don't think it can possibly be all bread, because then anytime anybody ate bread, they would be doing communion. And that would render the statement sort of meaningless as well. So one interpretative tool we can use here is to ask which of these kinds of use of the word is renders the sentence most meaningful. And so I think between Glenn and Lydia, we're narrowing in on something like, anytime this act of eating is performed in a ritual way, in memory of Jesus' sacrifice, then it is included in the set of things that count as Jesus' body. So it's a kind of inclusion. It's not clear yet whether that's a metaphorical inclusion or a literal inclusion, but Glenn has suggested perhaps that it's literal at the spiritual level, which might make it metaphorical at the physical level, if we think of the physical world as in somehow a metaphor for the spiritual world altogether. This is something akin to what Ezra says. He writes in, the metaphor has a twist. It refers to an ontological reality, the identity between Jesus and the bread. All spiritual truths are objectively real, but can only be expressed in human terms in some form of a metaphor. And this is leading me toward what I think my answer to this question would be. I have also done the homework assignment because I am a fellow student of yours and not actually your teacher or your master, but just somebody working these things out too, along with the sources and the history. And I do think that inclusion is the right mode of thought, the right grammatical mode of thought here. And I think that whatever's going on, it's akin to what goes on when we use metaphors in language, because the connection between the bread and Jesus' body is obviously not happening at the physical level, the material level that we mean when we use statements of identity like, that is my bike. When I point at something, I say, that is my bike, I'm saying the thing that I'm pointing at, the referent of my indication, is the object that I think of as the bike that is mine, and it's distinct from all others, right? There are many rifles like it, but this one is mine. That kind of thing is not what's going on here. Instead, we have something like the substance of the bread, or even the substance of the act itself. The bread, yes, but the body that eats it, and also the whole mind that turns toward it. And yeah, on some level, this makes it quote-unquote metaphorical, but I agree that there are some metaphors, this is kind of what Glenn is pointing at, there are some metaphors that are so true that they're almost more literal than the raw, brute, physical stuff that we're talking about. And when I say, for instance, that my heart leapt up when I beheld a rainbow in the sky, I'm not speaking literally, I'm using a kind of metaphor because my physical organ didn't jump up, but I am getting at something more essentially real than the mere physical actions of whatever went on. In other words, I've said something truer than if I gave a more accurate and literal, precise physical description of the chemicals that happen to be moving through my body at that time. We all sense in some way that certain metaphors actually give you access to a truth behind the physical reality. And in this case, I think the truth that's being revealed is one that is happening in the moment that Jesus is saying those words. When he says, "This is my body," he's not just saying, "Oh, this has always been my body," except in some eternal absolute sense. He's making a declaration that causes the thing to be true. And so this leads me in my answer to make reference to another concept that I want to introduce you to as a way of rounding out this discussion, and that is the concept of the speech act. So if this is somehow a metaphorical inclusion, or rather an identity or an inclusion between the essences of the two things, the essence of the act and the essence of whatever we mean by Jesus' body, his action, his will outworking in the world and all that those two things are being fused together in this moment, then "this is my body," when Jesus says it, is what we call a speech act. And a speech act is just words that do stuff. All kinds of words do stuff, and some words do things just by being said. Other words do things by way of the influence that they have on other people. But this whole concept is a very useful one for thinking about what Jesus is doing, because on the one hand, it's something that we have happen to us all the time. On the other hand, it's something very mystical, and one reason why Dumbledore says that words are our greatest source of magic. Because think about a classic example of a speech act, which is just a statement that causes a state of affairs to exist because you've made the statement. The classic example of this is, with this ring, I thee wed. At a wedding ceremony, you take the ring, you put it onto the hand of your betrothed, but if you just put a ring on the person, Beyonce was not quite right that you just have to put a ring on it, because if you just put a ring on the person, you're not married. There is some sense in which you got to say the words. You have to say the magic words, and then the wedding ceremony has been concluded, or at least part of the wedding ceremony requires you to say those words. And there are many different kinds of speech acts that you can do like this. Things like promises, for example. Until I say the words, I promise to be at your funeral, say, until I say those words, I haven't promised them. The minute I say those words, I have promised them. And the state of affairs between us is now different in a meaningful way. I have to do things now, if I want to get out of going to your funeral, that I didn't have to do before I made the promise. So that's, in my estimation, the purest kind of speech act, is this act that in the saying brings about the state of affairs that it describes. There are also different things that we can do and consider as speech acts. And these include intentions that we have behind things that we say. And actors think about this a lot, because in the script, when you're acting in a play, you always have to think about the intention behind the words. You think about, well, he said, there's a dirty ring on the kitchen counter, but you meant to hurt me. So that now there's a speech act going on that isn't implicit in the words themselves, the explicit meaning of the words, but that is active nevertheless, and intentionally active behind the words. It might have to do with the tone, the time, the way and when you said it. And a related and useful concept here is the concept of conversational implicature, which comes from H.P. Grice. Really cool idea. Basically, that the subtext of your language can be carrying on a whole conversation behind the scenes of the language itself. So those are also speech acts. And one thing that helps us to understand and learn is that speech acts have, among other things, among other features of speech acts, the most interesting feature for our purposes is the sincerity condition. So almost all speech acts have what is called in the lingo a sincerity condition, or several sincerity conditions. If I do intend to hurt you by pointing something out, then that's meaningfully a different speech act than if I don't intend. So maybe I'm just not all that good at social cues, and I'm like, wow, you sure have a big nose. I might hurt you. I might have done a speech act that hurt you, but I also haven't actually taken on the same kind of speech act than if I am very aware and I know well that I'm going to hurt you, and I still say it anyway. Wow, you've got a big nose. Or I say it loudly in your presence. Those are two different kinds of speech act because of my frame of mind, because of the way I'm regarding you, because of my intention in uttering the words, basically because of my whole psychic posture in making the statement. And this is also very true of speech acts that cause things to come into being, like promises. If I promise with my fingers crossed behind my back, I may still be ethically liable for the promise, but I haven't done the same kind of thing. I haven't really promised in some absolute way than compared to if I intended to promise, think I'm promising, and promise, and now I break that promise. Similarly, if I'm on stage and I say, I promise to love you until the day I die, nobody would expect me to go off stage in my regular life and marry you, because that's not really the kind of speech act that I've performed. So there are layers and layers to these things, and they have to do with the inward attitude of attention and intention on the part of the speaker and also the part of the receiver. So I think that in a perfectly normal and understandable human way, and yet in a sort of miracle, we can think of what Jesus says at the Last Supper as a speech act. He was a human, we know this. capable of all kinds of human language that we're capable of. And in stating, "This is my body," about this Last Supper, about the ritual meal that his disciples were about to take, he was engaging in a speech act. He was declaring that this Passover meal, which up until that point had been a foretaste, a forerunner of God's salvation, now is, by his desire and his design, the embodiment of his body, his blood, broken for us, shed for us. And because he was the instigator, the institutor of the festival, because he's God, he has the authority to make that speech act, just in the same way that some people have the authority to promise some things and not others. I have the authority to promise that there will be a Young Heretics episode on Tuesday because it's my show, and I run it, and I make the episodes. I don't have the authority to declare that Jocko Willink will make a podcast about the Olympics tomorrow, because that's not my podcast. So when you have authority, you are able to perform speech acts which, in pure sincerity, change the nature of the game. The minute I say to you there's going to be a podcast up tomorrow, now it is true that the podcast Young Heretics is committed to having an episode up tomorrow because I said it, because of that speech act. Jesus laid claim to being the God who commanded the festival of Passover, has the authority to perform a speech act which changes the meaning of Passover. Now we get to this question of, is that meaning metaphorical or literal? And I would suggest to you that in the cases of symbols, and especially spiritual rituals, it's the same thing, that metaphor and literal are, in some sense, identical, in a way that they're not in other cases, because what we do in ritual is we use physical objects to embody spiritual truths and realities. Therefore, when Jesus does his speech act, he's done his work. He has, with full intention behind the words, changed the meaning of the festival and said that this bread will now be, in some spiritual sense, on a metaphorical plane that is not the merely literal physical fleshly sense, but in this spiritual way, his body. Now it's our turn to do our job. Those who take communion also perform speech acts. They say amen, or they say, "Lord, I am not worthy to receive thee, but only enter under my roof, and thy soul shall be healed, my soul shall be healed," etc., etc. When we say those things, we create a posture that makes our speech acts effective, so that the metaphor is working on us. Because the secret of metaphors is not that they're less true than literal statements. It's that they depend upon the mental state, the condition, the psychic posture of both the writer and the reader in order to enter into the spirit of them and understand. And I think this is why it's great when, in some liturgies, we say, "Sanctify these gifts to be for us the body and blood of your Son, Jesus Christ," because God is doing his job on that end, and we now do our job by thinking of this bread and this wine as a symbol, a physical stand-in for Jesus' body. Then the question becomes, well, what is Jesus' body? It's a physical embodiment in a guy who walked around of everything God has to say about his relationship to us and our relationship with him. That it is broken for us, that it feeds and nourishes us, that it cleanses us, all this stuff. And when you eat something, when you eat a piece of bread in that attitude, in that posture, then it literally becomes a material effect upon you, because the thing that then happens is the bread works its way through your digestive system. You feel it, you taste it, you might have been hungry, now you're not, now you're fed. Maybe you feel the wine a little bit, warms you up. This is one reason why I'm actually a big fan of taking communion with bread that you would actually chomp down on, chew into, and wine that you would actually take a gulp of. Because when you do it in these abstracted ways, you really don't only think about it. When you do it in a way that is tangible and material and it's a real meal, then it starts to work its way through your digestive system. And suddenly, all the things that you experience when you eat something take on for you a whole new significance. They have this metaphorical significance because you have consented in your speech act to regard them that way. And by choosing to regard them that way, you make them that for you. You have that authority over your experience of taking communion, and therefore your speech act is effective to turn even your digestive system into an embodiment of what God is doing for you when you take communion. So ultimately, through this very particular statement of, I would say, inclusion of the word is, that anytime, whenever you drink it, do this in memory of me, Jesus has performed a speech act that stretches all the way up from the highest heaven down right into your digestive tract, because it does then literally affect you in a physical way. It's just that physical effect has taken on all this meaning through the mutual speech act of you and God. And this, if you think about it, is very appropriate because God works almost exclusively through speech acts, having as he does authority not just over this or that podcast, but over all existence and creation and reality. The most famous speech act ever performed, although it's not usually thought of it this way, is "Let there be light." And there was light. And in Hebrew, the connection between "let there be" and "there was" is very, very tight, because what's being said here is this is a God who intends things, speaks them, and in the speaking does them. So his whole modus operandi, his whole brand is speech acts. And Jesus is the ultimate speech act. He is the Word made flesh. He literally becomes this walking, talking dude that embodies in material flesh everything that God has to say about himself vis-a-vis us and us vis-a-vis God. That's what Jesus' body is. And so when the bread is the body, it is now, through the same kind of act, through the same speech act, becoming an extension of that thing. And since you are fed by the bread, and now part of your body contains particles of the bread, you are now an extension of that thing. So you are supposed to go away then and become, by the conscious assent of your will, a little miniature version of what God does when he incarnates himself in Jesus. And I think that is really, really cool. And I mean that, by the way, obviously, this is stuff that I believe, so I'm preaching to you in some way, although always with the caveat that I'm not your priest, and you should take the view on these things that you find most appealing from within the tradition. But I am, in some sense, telling you what I believe about this thing, that it is a speech act with a metaphorical structure that nevertheless is true and literally real on every possible level. But just as a nerd, I find it really interesting too. So even if you're not with me on this particular plank of the Christian tree, or you're not in any religion, I just think this is one of the most profound linguistic acts perhaps in history, and it is designed in this fascinating literary way that even when you start asking nuts and bolts grammatical questions about it, and by the way, this is the sort of thing that it does hold true in English and in Greek. I've been speaking as if this were an English sentence. It is, in fact, all of this stuff is written in Greek in the Gospels, but these particular features of the English language are shared with Greek. So once you just start submitting it to this nuts and bolts analysis and doing funny little homework assignments about it, you start to realize it is actually an ornate and elaborately constructed linguistic cathedral, if nothing else. And I think it's a whole lot more than that. But I'm, as always, very, very curious to know what you think. This is one of those ones that, we'll probably keep talking about until the end of days, because it's certainly been a matter of dispute and discussion in the church since even before the Protestant Reformation. Still, there's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Let me know what you think. You can do that by writing into me at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. I have a few other topics I'm going to get to on these words episodes, but I'm also always eager to hear about your questions. They don't have to be Bible related. They can be anything language related at all. And when you go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com, you can sign up to get a weekly newsletter, but you can also write me back. Suddenly, the crowd speaks back, and you can write into me over email, or you can DM me, or you do whatever you like to get in touch with me that way. I have a big stack of things, but sometimes a question is just so interesting that I nudge it to the front of the line. So do send me your questions about translation, about language, about how all this works, and I will do my best to answer them next time when I see you again for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.